The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious by Carl Gustav Jung. Part 1. The Effects of the Unconscious upon Consciousness. The Personal and the Collective Unconscious. In Freud's view, as most people know, the contents of the unconscious are reducible to infantile tendencies, which are repressed because of their incompatible character. Repression is a process that begins in early childhood under the moral influence of the environment and continues throughout life. By means of analysis, the repressions are removed and the repressed wishes made conscious. According to this theory, the unconscious contains only those parts of the personality which could just as well be conscious and have been suppressed only through the process of education. Although from one point of view, the infantile tendencies of the unconscious are the most conspicuous, it would nonetheless be a mistake to define or evaluate the unconscious entirely in these terms. The unconscious has still another side to it. It includes not only repressed contents, but all psychic material that lies below the threshold of consciousness. It is impossible to explain the subliminal nature of all this material on the principle of repression, for in that case, the removal of repression ought to endow a person with a prodigious memory, which would thenceforth forget nothing. We therefore emphatically affirm that in addition to the repressed material, the unconscious contains all those psychic components that have fallen below the threshold, as well as subliminal sense perceptions. Moreover, we know from abundant experience as well as for theoretical reasons that the unconscious also contains all the material that has not yet reached the threshold of consciousness. These are the seeds of future conscious contents. Equally, we have reason to suppose that the unconscious is never quiescent in the sense of being inactive, but is ceaselessly engaged in grouping and regrouping its contents. This activity should be thought of as completely autonomous only in pathological cases. Normally, it is coordinated with the conscious mind in a compensatory relationship. It is to be assumed that all these contents are of a personal nature insofar as they are acquired during the individual's life. Since this life is limited, the number of acquired contents in the unconscious must also be limited. This being so, it might be thought possible to empty the unconscious either by analysis or by making a complete inventory of the unconscious contents, on the ground that the unconscious cannot produce anything more than what is already known and assimilated into consciousness. We should also have to suppose, as already said, that if one could arrest the descent of conscious contents into the unconscious by doing away with repression, unconscious productivity would be paralyzed. This is possible only to a very limited extent, as we know from experience. We urge our patients to hold fast to repressed contents that have been reassociated with consciousness and to assimilate them into their plan of life. But this procedure, as we may daily convince ourselves, makes no impression on the unconscious, since it calmly goes on producing dreams and fantasies, which, according to Freud's original theory, must arise from personal repressions. If in such cases we pursue our observations systematically and without prejudice, we shall find material which, although similar in form to the previous personal contents, yet seems to contain illusions that go far beyond the personal sphere. Casting about in my mind for an example to illustrate what I have just said, I have a particularly vivid memory of a woman patient with a mild hysterical neurosis which, as we expressed it in those days, about 1910, had its principal cause in a father complex. By this, we wanted to denote the fact that the patient's peculiar relationship to her father stood in her way. She had been on very good terms with her father, who had since died. It was a relationship chiefly of feeling. In such cases, it is usually the intellectual function that is developed, and this later becomes the bridge to the world. Accordingly, our patient became a student of philosophy. Her energetic pursuit of knowledge was motivated by her need to extricate herself from the emotional entanglement with her father. This operation may succeed if her feelings can find an outlet on the new intellectual level, perhaps in the formation of an emotional tie with a suitable man, equivalent to the former tie. In this particular case, however, the transition refused to take place because the patient's feelings remained suspended, oscillating between her father and a man who was not altogether suitable. The progress of her life was thus held up, and that inner disunity so characteristic of a neurosis promptly made its appearance. The so-called normal person would probably be able to break the emotional bond in one or the other direction by a powerful act of will, or else, and this is perhaps the more usual thing, He would come through the difficulty unconsciously, on the smooth path of instinct, without ever being aware of the sort of conflict that lay behind his headaches or other physical discomforts. But any weakness of instinct, which may have many causes, is enough to hinder a smooth, unconscious transition. Then all progress is delayed by conflict, and the resulting stasis of life is equivalent to a neurosis. In consequence of the standstill, psychic energy flows off in every conceivable direction, apparently quite uselessly. For instance, there are excessive innervations of the sympathetic system, which lead to nervous disorders of the stomach and intestines, or the vagus, and consequently the heart, is stimulated, or fantasies and memories, uninteresting enough in themselves, become overvalued and prey on the conscious mind, mountains out of molehills. In this state, a new motive is needed to put an end to the morbid suspension. Nature herself paves the way for this, unconsciously and indirectly, through the phenomenon of the transference. In the course of treatment, the patient transfers the father imago to the doctor, thus making him, in a sense, the father, and in the sense that he is not the father, also making him a substitute for the man she cannot reach. The doctor therefore becomes both a father and a kind of lover, in other words, an object of conflict. In him the opposites are united, and for this reason he stands for a quasi-ideal solution of the conflict. Without in the least wishing it, he draws upon himself an overvaluation that is almost incredible to the outsider, for to the patient he seems like a savior or a god. This way of speaking is not altogether so laughable as it sounds. It is indeed a bit much to be a father and lover at once. Nobody could possibly stand up to it in the long run, precisely because it is too much of a good thing. One would have to be a demigod at least to sustain such a role without a break, for all the time one would have to be the giver. To the patient in the state of transference, this provisional solution naturally seems ideal, but only at first. In the end, she comes to a standstill that is just as bad as the neurotic conflict was. Fundamentally, nothing has yet happened that might lead to a real solution. The conflict has merely been transferred. Nevertheless, a successful transference can, at least temporarily, cause the whole neurosis to disappear, and for this reason it has been very rightly recognized by Freud as a healing factor of first-rate importance, but at the same time as a provisional state only, for although it holds out the possibility of a cure, it is far from being the cure itself. This somewhat lengthy discussion seemed to me essential if my example was to be understood, for my patient had arrived at the state of transference and had already reached the upper limit where the standstill begins to make itself disagreeable. The question now arose, what next? I had, of course, become the complete savior, and the thought of having to give me up was not only exceedingly distasteful to the patient, but positively terrifying. In such a situation, sound common sense generally comes out with a whole repertory of admonitions. You simply must. You really ought. You just cannot, etc. So far as sound common sense is, happily, not too rare and not entirely without effect, pessimists I know exist, a rational motive can, in the exuberant feeling of buoyancy you get from the transference, release so much enthusiasm that a painful sacrifice can be risked with a mighty effort of will. If successful, and these things sometimes are, the sacrifice bears blessed fruit, and the erstwhile patient leaps at one bound into the state of being practically cured. The doctor is generally so delighted that he fails to tackle the theoretical difficulties connected with this little miracle. If the leap does not succeed, and it did not succeed with my patient, one is then faced with the problem of resolving the transference. Here, psychoanalytic theory shrouds itself in a thick darkness. Apparently, we are to fall back on some nebulous trust in fate. Somehow or other, the matter will settle itself. The transference stops automatically when the patient runs out of money, as a slightly cynical colleague once remarked to me, or the ineluctable demands of life make it impossible for the patient to linger on in the transference, demands which compel the involuntary sacrifice, sometimes with a more or less complete relapse as a result. One may look in vain for accounts of such cases in the books that sing the praises of psychoanalysis. To be sure, there are hopeless cases where nothing helps, but there are also cases that do not get stuck and do not inevitably leave the transference situation with bitter hearts and sore heads. I told myself, at this juncture with my patient, that there must be a clear and respectable way out of the impasse. My patient had long since run out of money, if indeed she ever possessed any, but I was curious to know what means nature would devise for a satisfactory way out of the transference deadlock. Since I never imagined that I was blessed with that sound common sense, which always knows exactly what to do in every quandary, and since my patient knew as little as I suggested to her that we could at least keep an eye open for any movements coming from a sphere of the psyche uncontaminated by our superior wisdom and our conscious plannings. That meant first and foremost her dreams. Dreams contain images and thought associations which we do not create with conscious intent. They arise spontaneously without our assistance and are representatives of a psychic activity withdrawn from our arbitrary will. Therefore, the dream is, properly speaking, a highly objective, natural product of the psyche, from which we might expect indications, or at least hints, about certain basic trends in the psychic process. Now, since the psychic process, like any other life process, is not just a causal sequence, but is also a process with a teleological orientation, we might expect dreams to give us certain indicia about the objective causality, as well as about the objective tendencies, precisely because dreams are nothing less than self-representations of the psychic life process. On the basis of these reflections, then, we subjected the dreams to a careful examination. It would lead too far to quote word for word all the dreams that now followed. Let it suffice to sketch their main character. The majority referred to the person of the doctor, that is to say, the actors were unmistakably the dreamer herself and her doctor. The latter, however, seldom appeared in his natural shape, but was generally distorted in a remarkable way. Sometimes his figure was of supernatural size, sometimes he seemed to be extremely aged, then again he resembled her father, but was at the same time curiously woven into nature, as in the following dream. Her father, who in reality was of small stature, was standing with her on a hill that was covered with wheat fields. She was quite tiny beside him, and he seemed to her like a giant. He lifted her up from the ground and held her in his arms like a little child. The wind swept over the wheat fields, and as the wheat swayed in the wind, he rocked her in his arms. From this dream and from others like it, I could discern various things. Above all, I got the impression that her unconscious was holding unshakably to the idea of my being the father-lover, so that the fatal tie we were trying to undo appeared to be doubly strengthened. Moreover, one could hardly avoid seeing that the unconscious placed a special emphasis on the supernatural, almost divine nature of the father-lover, thus accentuating still further the overvaluation occasioned by the transference. I therefore asked myself whether the patient had still not understood the wholly fantastic character of her transference, or whether perhaps the unconscious could never be reached by understanding at all, but must blindly and idiotically pursue some nonsensical chimera. Freud's idea that the unconscious can do nothing but wish, Schopenhauer's blind and aimless will, the Gnostic demiurge who in his vanity deems himself perfect, and then in the blindness of his limitation creates something lamentably imperfect. All these pessimistic suspicions of an essentially negative background to the world and the soul came threateningly near. And there would indeed be nothing to set against this except a well-meaning "you ought," reinforced by a stroke of the axe that would cut down the whole phantasmagoria for good and all. But, as I turned the dreams over and over in my mind, there dawned on me another possibility. I said to myself, it cannot be denied that the dreams continue to speak in the same old metaphors with which our conversations have made the patient as well as myself sickeningly familiar. But the patient has an undoubted understanding of her transference fantasy. She knows that I appear to her as a semi-divine father-lover, and she can, at least intellectually, distinguish this from my factual reality. Therefore, the dreams are obviously reiterating the conscious standpoint minus the conscious criticism, which they completely ignore. They reiterate the conscious contents, not in toto, but insist on the fantastic standpoint as opposed to sound common sense. I naturally asked myself what was the source of this obstinacy and what was its purpose. That it must have some purposive meaning I was convinced, for there is no truly living thing that does not have a final meaning, that can in other words be explained as a mere leftover from antecedent facts. But the energy of the transference is so strong that it gives one the impression of a vital instinct. That being so, what is the purpose of such fantasies? A careful examination and analysis of the dreams, especially of the one just quoted, revealed a very marked tendency, in contrast to conscious criticism, which always seeks to reduce things to human proportions, to endow the person of the doctor with superhuman attributes. He had to be gigantic, primordial, huger than the Father, like the wind that sweeps over the earth. Was he then to be made into a god? Or, I said to myself, was it rather the case that the unconscious was trying to create a god out of the person of the doctor, as it were to free a vision of God from the veils of the personal, so that the transference to the person of the doctor was no more than a misunderstanding on the part of the conscious mind, a stupid trick played by sound common sense? Was the urge of the unconscious perhaps only apparently reaching out towards the person, but in a deeper sense towards a god? Could the longing for a god be a passion welling up from our darkest instinctual nature, a passion unswayed by any outside influences, deeper and stronger perhaps than the love for a human person? Or was it perhaps the highest and truest meaning of that inappropriate love we call transference, a little bit of real Gottesminne that has been lost to consciousness ever since the 15th century? No one will doubt the reality of a passionate longing for a human person, but that a fragment of religious psychology, an historical anachronism, indeed something of a medieval curiosity, we are reminded of Mechthild of Magdeburg, should come to light as an immediate living reality in the middle of the consulting room and be expressed in the prosaic figure of the doctor, seems almost too fantastic to be taken seriously. A genuinely scientific attitude must be unprejudiced. The sole criterion for the validity of an hypothesis is whether or not it possesses an heuristic, i.e., explanatory value. The question now is, can we regard the possibilities set forth above as a valid hypothesis? There is no a priori reason why it should not be just as possible that the unconscious tendencies have a goal beyond the human person, as that the unconscious can do nothing but wish. Experience alone can decide which is the more suitable hypothesis. This new hypothesis was not entirely plausible to my very critical patient. The earlier view that I was the father-lover, and as such presented an ideal solution of the conflict, was incomparably more attractive to her way of feeling. Nevertheless, her intellect was sufficiently keen to appreciate the theoretical possibility of the new hypothesis. Meanwhile, the dreams continued to disintegrate the person of the doctor and swell him to ever vaster proportions. Concurrently with this, there now occurred something which at first I alone perceived, and with the utmost astonishment, namely a kind of subterranean undermining of the transference. Her relations with a certain friend deepened perceptibly, notwithstanding the fact that consciously she still clung to the transference. So that when the time came for leaving me, it was no catastrophe, but a perfectly reasonable parting. I had the privilege of being the only witness during the process of severance. I saw how the transpersonal control point developed, I cannot call it anything else, a guiding function, and step by step gathered to itself all the former personal overvaluations. How, with this afflux of energy, it gained influence over the resisting conscious mind without the patient's consciously noticing what was happening. From this, I realized that the dreams were not just fantasies, but self-representations of unconscious developments which allowed the psyche of the patient gradually to grow out of the pointless personal tie. This change took place, as I showed, through the unconscious development of a transpersonal control point, a virtual goal, as it were, that expressed itself symbolically in a form which can only be described as a vision of God. The dreams swelled the human person of the doctor to superhuman proportions, making him a gigantic primordial father who is at the same time the wind, and in whose protecting arms the dreamer rests like an infant. If we try to make the patient's conscious and traditionally Christian idea of God responsible for the divine image in the dreams, we would still have to lay stress on the distortion. In religious matters, the patient had a critical and agnostic attitude, and her idea of a possible deity had long since passed into the realm of the inconceivable, that is, had dwindled into a complete abstraction. In contrast to this, the God image of the dreams corresponded to the archaic conception of a nature demon, something like Wotan. God is spirit, is here translated back into its original form where it means wind. God is the wind, stronger and mightier than man, an invisible breath spirit. As in Hebrew ruah, so in Arabic ruh means breath and spirit. Out of the purely personal form, the dreams develop an archaic God image that is infinitely far from the conscious idea of God. It might be objected that this is simply an infantile image, a childhood memory. I would have no quarrel with this assumption if we were dealing with an old man sitting on a golden throne in heaven. but there is no trace of any sentimentality of that kind. Instead, we have a primordial idea that can correspond only to an archaic mentality. These primordial ideas, of which I have given a great many examples in my symbols of transformation, oblige one to make, in regard to unconscious material, a distinction of quite a different character from that between preconscious and unconscious, or subconscious and unconscious. The justification for these distinctions need not be discussed here. They have their specific value and are worth elaborating further as points of view. The fundamental distinction which experience has forced upon me claims to be no more than that. It should be evident from the foregoing that we have to distinguish in the unconscious a layer which we may call the personal unconscious. The materials contained in this layer are of a personal nature insofar as they have the character partly of acquisitions derived from the individual's life and partly of psychological factors which could just as well be conscious. It can readily be understood that incompatible psychological elements are liable to repression and therefore become unconscious. But on the other hand, this implies the possibility of making and keeping the repressed contents conscious once they have been recognized. We recognize them as personal contents because their effects, or their partial manifestation, or their source, can be discovered in our personal past. They are the integral components of the personality, they belong to its inventory, and their loss to consciousness produces an inferiority in one respect or another. An inferiority, moreover, that has the psychological character not so much of an organic lesion or an inborn defect, as of a lack which gives rise to a feeling of moral resentment. The sense of moral inferiority always indicates that the missing element is something which, to judge by this feeling about it, really ought not be missing, or which could be made conscious if only one took sufficient trouble. The moral inferiority does not come from a collision with the generally accepted and, in a sense, arbitrary moral law, but from the conflict with one's own self which, for reasons of psychic equilibrium, demands that the deficit be redressed. Whenever a sense of moral inferiority appears, it indicates not only a need to assimilate an unconscious component, but also the possibility of such assimilation. In the last resort, it is a man's moral qualities which force him, either through direct recognition of the need or indirectly through a painful neurosis, to assimilate his unconscious self and to keep himself fully conscious. Whoever progresses along this road of self-realization must inevitably bring into consciousness the contents of the personal unconscious, thus enlarging the scope of his personality. I should add at once that this enlargement has to do primarily with one's moral consciousness, one's knowledge of oneself, for the unconscious contents that are released and brought into consciousness by analysis are usually unpleasant, which is precisely why these wishes, memories, tendencies, plans, etc., were repressed. These are the contents that are brought to light in much the same way by a thorough confession, though to a much more limited extent. The rest comes out as a rule in dream analysis. It is often very interesting to watch how the dreams fetch up the essential points, bit by bit, and with the nicest choice. The total material that is added to consciousness causes a considerable widening of the horizon, a deepened self-knowledge which, more than anything else one would think, is calculated to humanize a man and make him modest. But even self-knowledge, assumed by all wise men to be the best and most efficacious, has different effects on different characters. We make very remarkable discoveries in this respect in practical analysis, but I shall deal with this question in the next chapter. As my example of the archaic idea of God shows, the unconscious seems to contain other things besides personal acquisitions and belongings. My patient was quite unconscious of the derivation of spirit from wind, or of the parallelism between the two. This content was not the product of her thinking, nor had she ever been taught it. The critical passage in the New Testament was inaccessible to her since she knew no Greek. If we must take it as a wholly personal acquisition, it might be a case of so-called cryptomnesia, the unconscious recollection of a thought which the dreamer had once read somewhere. I have nothing against such a possibility in this particular case, but I have seen a sufficient number of other cases, many of them are to be found in the book mentioned above, where cryptomnesia can be excluded with certainty. Even if it were a case of cryptomnesia, which seems to me very improbable, we should still have to explain what the predisposition was that caused just this image to be retained, and later, as Simon puts it, ekphorated, Latin effere, to produce. In any case, cryptomnesia or no cryptomnesia, we are dealing with a genuine and thoroughly primitive God image that grew up in the unconscious of a civilized person and produced a living effect, an effect which might well give the psychologist of religion food for reflection. There is nothing about this image that could be called personal. It is a wholly collective image, the ethnic origin of which has long been known to us. Here is an historical image of worldwide distribution that has come into existence again through a natural psychic function. This is not so very surprising, since my patient was born into the world with a human brain which presumably still functions today much as it did of old. We are dealing with a reactivated archetype, as I have elsewhere called these primordial images. These ancient images are restored to life by the primitive analogical mode of thinking peculiar to dreams. It is not a question of inherited ideas, but of inherited thought patterns. In view of these facts, we must assume that the unconscious contains not only personal, but also impersonal collective components in the form of inherited categories or archetypes. I have therefore advanced the hypothesis that at its deeper levels, the unconscious possesses collective contents in a relatively active state. That is why I speak of a collective unconscious.